This part explains why computational creativity begins by refusing to define its own subject. Creativity resists definition because it exists to subvert its own conventions, so the field's founding move is to stop defining it and instead pin it to process. Specific algorithms, knowledge structures, generative search, the impetus must originate in the machine, not the human. Novelty plus value. What makes this more than engineering is the closed loop. Each built artifact, a story, a poem, a metaphor, a joke, is at the same time an empirical test of the theory of creativity that generated it. Science and engineering co-validate. A theory earns its keep only by producing a system whose outputs a human would call creative. The primitive here is operationalizing an undefinable phenomenon by making its generator double as its own experiment. This section explains how the opening chapter redefines creativity. Creativity stops being a property of the artifact and becomes a property of the process that owns it. The chapter's move is to strip the word creative of its folk metaphors and rebind it to specific algorithms, to knowledge structures, and, decisively, to a self-evaluation loop. A machine that only flings outputs at an audience is merely generative. Creativity begins where the system also judges its own novelty and value, and can justify the verdict. That single cut separates the creator from the forger. Pastiche mimics a safe pocket of output, space, and so never risks self-critiques or surprises. The whole volume inherits this frame. Each built artifact becomes an empirical test of a theory of creativity. This part explains how one framework folds two kinds of creativity into a single recursive machine. Bowden split creativity two ways: exploring a fixed conceptual space or transforming the rules that define it. Wiggins collapses the split. He models a creative agent as a septuple, a seven-part structure. There is a universe U of all possible concepts, a language, L for rules and 3 rule sets. R bounds the space. R bounds the space. R bounds the space. RG values what is found. To create is to iterate the search, the triple R, T, and E outward from the empty concept. Here is the move that pays. Transforming the rules is itself exploration, whose search objects are R and T themselves. It is the identical machine run one meta level up, with L now playing the role of the universe. Two creativities become one recursive kind. This septuple is the book's spine. Every later chapter fills in a slot of it. This section explains creativity as search, made precise enough to compare machines. Wiggins takes Bowden's informal split, exploratory versus transformational, and gives it a mechanism. A rule set defines a conceptual space, and a creative act locates new objects inside it. Exploration moves within the rules. Transformation edits the rules themselves. The primitive worth keeping is that these are the same operation at two levels. Transformation is exploration lifted to the space of rule sets, a search over searches. Formalizing this turns a vague taxonomy into something you can prove properties of a priori and apply to any system, artificial, natural, or hybrid. The chapter's job is to hand the rest of the book that shared measuring instrument, the CSF. This section explains why creativity is something an observer grants and what a system must make visible to earn that judgment. Creativity is a verdict that an observer issues. The artifact does not carry it as an intrinsic property. The verdict turns almost entirely on whether the system seems to think for itself. Ventura's survey isolates the two attributions that gate that verdict: The first is intentionality. The act meant something. The second is autonomy. The system and not its author chose the meaning. This inverts the engineering target. You stop building a novelty generator and you start building legible evidence of two invisible attitudes. Darky supplies the pattern. Intentionality is shown by communicating a concept through shared perceptual grounding. Autonomy is shown by the system selecting its own goals through imagination, inspiration, and meta-level self-modification. The generative move is observer relative. Make the hidden mental stance readable, and creativity gets attributed. This section explains why creativity lives in the observer, not the object, and what that costs the machine that wants to be called creative. Creativity is not a property of the artifact. It is an attribution the observer confers, and the price of that attribution is perceived process, never product. Ventura's lever is a Wizard of Oz experiment. Hold the actual source fixed, a human at a remote terminal, and you can still raise attributed creativity simply by raising the apparent sophistication of the process. Attribution tracks perceived process, a somber product. So what people demand before they grant creativity is evidence that the system can think for itself. They want intentionality and they want autonomy. This flips the engineering problem. The target is not better outputs, but legible self-direction, together with a sound method to evaluate it. Darcy is the existence proof that both can be manufactured and shown. This part explains why conceptual blending is hard to compute, and the trick Veal uses to make a tractable version of it. Blending, in Falconier and Turner's sense, is a two-way stir, where source and target commingle into genuinely emergent structure, going beyond one directional transfer. That is the pyrotechnical ceiling. Ethan Hawke's badass Christopherson, a Frankenstein of Brad Pitt plus, borrowed star parts, is what people do effortlessly and machines cannot. Veal's move is a retreat to a tractable subspecies, the mashup, blending restricted enough to compute while keeping most of the utility. The generative primitive is bounded rationality applied to a cognitive operation. You do not model the intractable ideal. You carve the largest fragment that ships. The chapter's understated surprise sits in its second half. The world knowledge a mashup needs is harvested from the everyday questions people already put to the web, so the machine bootstraps its beliefs from others' curiosity. This section explains how conceptual blending differs from analogy and why one part of it can be built by a machine. Analogy is a one-way pipe. Structure flows from the source to the target, and both endpoints survive intact. Blending breaks that valve. Source and target commutate, stirred together into a third counterfactual space that carries emergent structure, neither input held on its own. Think of Brad Pitt rewritten with Chris Christopherson's resume, and no, or a portrait quietly aging in George Clooney's attic. The generative move is that a blend is itself a new concept, so it nests. You can build blends of blends, as when the Guardian imagines a Dorian Gray inside a Clooney, inside a Mendes. Veal's engineering wager for the chapter runs like this. The full pyrotechnical phenomenon resists computation, but a robust subset, the conceptual mashup, does not. This holds provided the machine harvests its common sense from the casual questions people already pose to the web, and then learns to pose its own. This section explains how Divago makes conceptual blending computable. Blending becomes computable the moment you stop asking what two concepts combine into and start asking which combinations survive selection. Divago aligns two domain graphs by their largest shared relational skeleton, a structural isomorphism where the nodes themselves are irrelevant. It then enumerates every way each matched pair can project. Keep both, keep neither, or fuse the two into one. That product space is called the blendoid, and it holds every possible blend at once. A genetic algorithm searches it under a fitness function built from 7 formalized optimality principles, read as competing pressures. The generative primitive here is generate and test. The blendoid generates, and the constraints select. Novelty lives in the pressure that culls, not in the act of combining. Divago is defined by what its constraints reward, rather than by whatever its two inputs happen to contain. This part explains creativity reduced to its smallest executable move, and the 4-space network that runs it. Creativity at its smallest executable move is this. Take 2 knowledge domains that share some common skeleton, project selected pieces of each into a 3rd space, and let that space grow structure neither parent had. It is not concatenation. It is emergence under constraint. This is conceptual blending's 4-space network, 2 inputs, a generic space holding what they share, and a blend. Chapter 5's claim is that Divago is one of the first systems to actually run this network, rather than merely describe it. The anchor is the computer virus. Program maps to virus, computer maps to host, and then selective projection yields a domain neither input contained. The filter that does the real work is the set of optimality principles, integration, unpacking, and relevance. These are what separate the few good blends from the combinatorial flood of possible ones. This part explains how creativity gets mechanized into a search over 2 literatures. Creativity, strict to its skeleton, is an element made to sit in the intersection of 2 frames that normally never touch. This is Koestler's bisociation, sharply distinct from association, which stays inside one frame. Archimedes bisociates water displacement with volume. The anchor is the structure, not the bath. The chapter's move is to mechanize that intersection. Over-specialization buries knowledge in disjoint literatures, so search 2 of them for the bridging term, a word living in both. The computational image of Koestler's vibrating L. Serendipity becomes a data mining target. Everything downstream, Crosby ranking B terms and outlier documents as the richest hunting ground is machinery for one idea. Rediscover what was accidental by scanning the overlap systematically. This section explains creativity as intersection rather than pure generation. Creativity here means intersection, what Koestler called bisociation, one idea, read coherently inside 2 self-consistent frames that habitually never touch. Take 2 literatures that do not cite each other. The discovery, if one exists, is carried by a single bridging term, a word meaning something in each silo, whose double life is the latent link. Archimedes' displacement is one such bridge, joining the bath to geometry. So creative discovery collapses to a ranking problem. Score every shared term by how strongly it bisociates across the 2 corpora. Surface the top bridges, which is what Crosby does, then prune the search to the outlier documents where such bridges concentrate. The insight is the intersection itself. The engine just finds where 2 frames cross. This section explains how computational design treats creativity as one adjustable quantity rather than a special faculty. Design creativity is a single dial turned up. The dial governs 2 things at once: how far representations are allowed to reform and how deep the transferred structure runs. Goal strips analogy down to its skeleton. You recall a familiar problem and solution pair, then map selected parts of it onto a new problem. Goal then rejects the classical narrowing that fixed the transferred unit as surface components. What actually crosses domains is relational structure. These are generic abstractions over how parts behave to achieve a function, and they are portable precisely because they name relations, not objects. Creativity then lies on a continuum. Its degree is set by how much the problem gets reformulated and how abstract the transfer is. Case-based reasoning falls out as the limiting case, where transfer degenerates into mere modification. This part explains the single operation that design creativity reduces to, and how goal widens it into a generative primitive. Design creativity reduces to one operation, analogical transfer. You recall a remembered design situation and carry knowledge from it into a new one. Goel's move is to widen the traditional narrow reading, where you retrieve an old problem solution pair and copy solution elements into a generative primitive. Two axes open it. The first concerns what transfers. It extends past components to any content at all, a problem, a solution, a pattern, or a strategy. The second concerns what it serves. It reaches past merely proposing the answer to any design task at all, framing, decomposing, evaluating, reformulating. Creativity then stops being binary. It lies on a continuum, graded by two things: how far the borrowed knowledge travels and how much the problem itself gets reformulated on the way. From this, you can predict the rest. The deeper the transferred structure, a causal model rather than a part, the more creative the leap. This section explains why evaluating a creative system is really an act of definition rather than measurement. Evaluation only looks like measurement. It is really definition smuggled in. This is Ritchie's move. You cannot score a creative system against a target that has no agreed target. Creative is an essentially contested concept in Galli's sense, so every proposed metric is a covert theory of what creativity actually is. The chapter makes this operable through a generative split. Creative in the loose sense means the system merely works in a domain society calls creative. It writes poems, however badly. Creative in the strict sense attributes excellence. Evaluation is then one precise question. Is this loosely creative system creative in the strict sense? The two methodological sub-questions, which properties to look for and how to measure them, inherit their answers from whichever theoretical aim you brought, science or engineering. No neutral yardstick exists. You build the ruler you measure with. This section explains why evaluating a creative system is inseparable from defining creativity in the first place. Evaluation only means something against a stated aim. Ritchie's chapter turns the question, is this system creative, into two operational questions: which behavioral properties to measure and how. The generative move is splitting one word in two. A system is creative in the L sense, merely by working in a domain society calls creative. It emits poems, it emits music. It is creative in the S sense only if it achieves excellence there. Calling a system's output, creative smuggles the L sense in as evidence for the S sense, and that is the field's recurring confusion. So evaluation is just the operational face of the unsolved question: what is creativity? And because that concept is essentially contested, no measurement is aim neutral. The target precedes the metric, and the target is disputed. This section explains where novelty actually lives. The claim is that novelty stops being a property of the artifact and becomes a property of the predictor watching it. Grace and Maher make a specific move. They measure novelty as the violation of an observer's confident expectation. Surprise is the complement of the likelihood that the observer's learned model assigned to the artifact. The older approach measured novelty as distance between a new artifact and the known ones. The reframe abandons distance for expectation. Consider two new phones. The next phone that differs from the old ones yet was predicted is not creative. The one whose difference the model failed to foresee is. Creativity lives in the failed prediction, not in the raw difference. Relocating the metric from artifact space to the observer's internal model buys three things that distance cannot. First, relational structure. Combinations that sit inside already known regions can still shock. Second, temporal dependence, since what the model expects changes as it learns. Third, a confidence gate that separates changes as it learns. Third, a confidence gate that separates genuine surprise from mere ignorance. The whole picture reduces to two sentences. Novelty is what your model did not see coming. Value decides whether that mattered. This section explains why novelty is best understood as prediction error rather than distance. Novelty is prediction error, not distance. Grace and Maher's move is to stop measuring how far an artifact sits from all prior ones, and to measure instead how badly it violates a confident expectation, the observer built from experience. Surprise becomes the complement of predicted likelihood, 1 minus p, the probability the observer assigned to what actually appeared. The locus shifts from the artifact to the observer, and time enters because expectations are learned and revised. The whole difference-based tradition becomes the degenerate case, the one where you predict a feature conditioned on nothing. The boundary that reveals the structure is this. The next phone model differs from the last, yet is fully expected, so difference alone is inert. Only the violation of a held prediction, when it is also valued, reads as creative. This section explains why a field cannot call its systems creative until it measures the way it measures. A field that calls its systems creative without a shared test cannot accumulate. Each system is presented, admired, or dismissed, and nothing transfers. Jordanist names. The failure mode after Pierce, the methodological malaise, absent stated criteria, comparison collapses, and progress stagnates. The generative move is reflexive. Stop only evaluating systems and evaluate the evaluations themselves. SPECS supplies the wrapper, state your creativity definition, derive tests from it, apply them transparently. 5 cross-disciplinary meta-criteria. Then judge the judging methods themselves. Here is the primitive to carry. Any field asserting a property of its artifacts must lift its own demand for justification, one level, onto the measuring instrument. Unmeasured, an evaluation method is exactly the unjustified claim it was built to forbid. This section explains how a field learns to judge its own instruments for measuring creativity. A field that calls its systems creative without ever measuring creativity has no way to tell progress from assertion. That gap is what this chapter closes, and it closes it by going up one level. The chapter gives a standard for judging the metrics themselves, rather than adding another creativity metric beside facts or Ritchie's criteria. It offers SPECS as an overarching procedure that any evaluation can be poured into, plus 5 meta-criteria that ask which evaluation method is the good one. The generative move is recursion. Turn the discipline's evaluative demand back on its own instruments. Once you have that, you can predict its shape anywhere. Whenever a field measures things, eventually something must measure the measures, on pain of stagnation. This part explains how one decomposition of creativity generates two mirror image forms of human and computer collaboration. Creativity is generation over a conceptual space, plus evaluation of what gets generated. Every human and computer pairing simply assigns each of those two halves to whoever owns it. The computer has throughput, but no quality metric. The human has judgment, but not scale. So the split is fixed by which faculty is missing. Computer-supported human creativity hands the human suggestions and keeps the human as the author. Human-supported computer creativity lets the machine carry the generative burden, while the human only restricts the space, prunes, or validates. What tips authorship all the way to the machine is Bowden's adaptive creativity. Mass personalization targets that shift continuously. No human throughput survives that load, so the machine has to bear it. This section explains how creativity splits between a human and a machine, and what decides which of them leads. Creativity factors into two faculties: generating candidates and judging them. Every pairing of a human and a computer is just a decision about which side holds which. The pivot is evaluation. A machine can flood the search space far past human reach, yet it usually cannot rank its own output, so the collaboration axis is fixed by where the quality metric lives. When the human keeps that metric, the machine only suggests, and you get computer-supported creativity. Graph-lof, subvertiser, every step decided by the user. When the machine carries a good enough metric to rank itself, the human collapses to a mediator nudging the key steps. This is human-supported creativity. The same generate and evaluate loop runs throughout. Who owns the missing faculty sets the mode. This section explains how Mexica grows story coherence from below instead of imposing it from above. Coherence in a story need not be imposed from above by a plot, grammar. It can be grown from below as a learned constraint. That inversion is the whole chapter. Predefined. Story structures by coherence at the price of predictability. Know the schema, predict the output, and the system stops reading as creative. Mexica discards the schema and lets social common sense knowledge find the sequence instead. The emotional and tension links accumulated between characters across past stories become the associative field that decides which next action makes sense, which next action makes sense. The current context is a cue, the knowledge base answers. Coherence turns emergent, a residue of what the system has read rather than a template handed to it. The swimsuit in the snowstorm never surfaces because nothing learned licenses it. This section explains how a story generator can stay coherent without following a template. Coherence in a generated plot need not descend from a template. It can emerge from what each action locally demands of its context. Mexica's wager is to push the constraint down into the atoms. Every action carries preconditions and postconditions encoding social common sense knowledge, and a next action fits only when the current story state satisfies it. No global skeleton means low story predictability. The tale stays flexible precisely because nothing dictates its shape in advance. Here is the counterintuitive lever. looser preconditions, open and intangible, such as John hates the villain rather than the silver gun, generalize across worlds in lower predictability, so weaker local constraints by stronger creative freedom. Structure dissolved into the pieces, then reprecipitated by matching. This part explains how to measure the creativity of an automatic poet. Measure a creative program not by its outputs in isolation, but against its inspiring set, the artifacts it began with. Creativity becomes displacement from that reference frame, resolved on two orthogonal axes at once. Typicality. Does it belong to the genre? And value? Is it any good? Ritchie's 14 criteria are just the coordinates on that plane. Gervas's move is reciprocal falsification. Apply these metrics to one concrete system, an automatic Spanish poet, and the poet tests the metrics exactly as the metrics test the poet. Neither theory nor artifact is privileged. Each is the other's assay. The chapter's role in the book is this bridge, the point where the field's evaluation formalisms stop being proposals and become instruments checked by contact with something that actually runs. This part explains what happens when creativity is turned into something measurable. Once you can measure it, creativity stops being a property of the poem and becomes a relation between the output set and the inspiring set. The program was fed. Gervas takes the book's evaluation instruments and turns them on real automatic poets. Those instruments are Ritchie's typicality versus quality criteria and the Colton, Pease, and Ritchie fine-tuning ratio, which exposes a system that is merely rediscovering what it was handed. He orders the poets not by chronology, but by how much knowledge their input encodes. That ordering is the move. The format and volume of built-in knowledge predicts what the metrics will read, so a poem score indicts its architecture. Theory is brought into contact with practice. Each measure is a test of the system, and each system is a test of the measure. This section explains how multi-agent models turn creativity from a thing an object possesses into a judgment a community renders. Creativity stops being a property an artifact has and becomes a verdict that a system of judges reaches. Csikszentmihalyi's domain, individual and field triad, is here rendered computational. Each agent runs only a local test for personal novelty, a hedonic function that peaks at moderate surprise, falls to boredom below it, and turns to aversion above it, and turns to aversion above it. And it passes on the artifacts it happens to like. The honorific creative is then whatever survives pairwise agreement. At least two agents must concur before a work enters the shared domain, so no agent can crown its own. The chapter's move is the deletion of the oracle. Liu's monolithic social creativity test, which secretly deferred to a human judge, dissolves into distributed consensus, the field's verdict being the aggregate of many myopic ones. The digital clockwork muse is this, made to run. This part reframes creativity as a circuit rather than a trait. Creativity becomes a loop that three subsystems close. A domain transmits knowledge, an individual produces a variation, and a field selects which variations re-enter the domain. Nothing is creative in isolation. The honorific is conferred by the loop, so to model it, you build the society, not the lone genius. That is the chapter's chosen second approach. Csikszentmihalyi's systems view is the primitive here, and the digital clockwork muse is its running instance. Structurally, this is variation and selection with one twist. The selector, the field, is itself made of agents, so the fitness function is endogenous and self-organizing. That single move, relocating creativity from substance to circuit, is what the chapter hands you. This section explains the chapter's central move, that creativity stops being optimization the moment the fitness function stops being fixed. That is its generative primitive. Single optimum search asks which point is best. McCormick dissolves the question by letting the components rewrite the very landscape they are ranked against. Niche construction makes selection endogenous, so the path becomes a chain of shifting intermediate goals, each seeding the next, rather than a climb toward one peak. Strip the anthropocentric premise that creativity needs intention, and anything producing adaptive novelty qualifies. Natural selection, ecosystems, the Klondike Space Explorer. The chapter's role in the book's arc is this relocation. It moves the word creative off the evaluator and onto the coupled dynamics of agent and environment itself, with exploration displacing search as the operative verb. This section explains McCormick's reconception of creativity as niche construction and why it needs no designer. Optimization assumes a fixed landscape with one peak worth reaching. Creativity has neither. McCormick's move is to discard the fixed fitness function entirely and to swap the lone hill climber for an ecosystem, components causally coupled to an environment they continuously modify. Because each agent reshapes the very conditions that select it, the landscape never holds still. The trajectory becomes a chain of shifting, self-generated goals instead of a march toward a global optimum. That is the whole chapter. Creativity reconceived as niche construction, exploration where the environment itself acts as memory. Nature supplies the proof. A non-teleological process, no designer, no intention, yet it invented eyes and wings. Appropriate novelty needs no guiding intelligence, only coupling and feedback. This section explains how a creativity engine turns novelty into something a machine can measure and pursue. Novelty becomes computable the moment you define it negatively. Train a classifier to tell the system's own past output from famous paintings, then evolve images the classifier fails to recognize as the system's own. Fitness is escape from self-recognition. Success means not looking like what you have already made. The move that makes it perpetual is the fold. Every escapee is added to the training set, and the classifier is retrained, so the boundary it patrols advances to enclose the new territory, and the next run must break out again. Think of a creativity engine as a receding horizon. The aesthetic model is deliberately made a moving target by its own successes. Adversarial in shape, but the discriminator learns from the generator's wins, ratcheting rather than converging. This section explains a form of machine creativity defined as escape from your own signature. A classifier learns to tell the system's past output apart from famous paintings. The evolutionary engine then breeds images that the classifier fails to file as self-made. Fitness is measured, deviation from one's own history. Fold those novel images back into the training set, retrain, and the recognizable self-boundary advances, forcing the generator to flee again. This is a permanent arms race against your own recognizability, the same adversarial loop structure as a GAN. But here, the discriminator hunts your past self rather than mere fakeness, so no equilibrium settles. Each success redefines the mold it just broke. The style you can no longer occupy is precisely the novelty you produced.